As Elena Guzman has rather flippantly noted, and the number of essay collections and other studies in the 21st century support, quote, "It is no longer outrageous to claim that performance can be a method of investigation, knowledge production, and scholarship," end quote. There's been much said in the past years and even decades about the idea of practice-based research under any of its variety of names. I'll save the theoretical background, however, for a very different version of this presentation. What I'd like to do today is to reflect fairly informally on my own experience of using archival research into a historical actor in my own character work, and how that research intersects with my own 21st century practice, both as a performer and as a scholar. Before I get to that reflective work, however, a bit of background is necessary. As part of the North American Victorian Studies Association annual conference, the 19th Century Theatre Caucus has, for the past 4 years, produced a semi-staged reading. These readings, performed by volunteers from the caucus and conference attendees more generally, have been selected by the caucus after having been proposed and then edited or adapted and directed by a member whose research addresses that particular piece or an element of it in some way. The first reading, John Broom's 1849 adaptation of Jane Eyre, for instance, was the subject of a chapter in director Amy Hawley's PhD dissertation. These readings contribute to the caucus's larger remit of increasing scholarly awareness of and interactions with and about the widespread performance culture of the period. What began as a bit of a novelty, however, has increasingly become performance as research in a variety of senses. Tom Recchio, the director of the 2018 reading, an adaptation of Elizabeth Gaskell's Lizzie Lee, turned the experience into a scholarly opportunity, considering, quote, "what it might mean to produce scholarship as an active embodiment, performance serving as both a mode of and a stimulus for inquiry," end quote, the results of which have recently been published in the journal 19th Century Theatre and Film. This shift to writing, of course, has been one of the focal points of much recent consideration about practice-based research. In another rather flippant comment, Jessica Naish laments that, quote, "paper is not performance," end quote, drawing attention to the continued privileging of written work over artistic creation in much of the academy. I would argue, however, following Gilly Bush Bailey, that practice can be both a research outcome and a research tool. However, in keeping with this increasing need to prove the scholarly work of performance by linking it with other, more conventional forms of scholarship, at this 2018 conference, the caucus decided to collaborate with the Aesthetics and Decadence Caucus. We would produce a relevant staged reading, and the two caucuses together would propose a related roundtable. The play chosen was Michael Field's A Question of Memory, and the corresponding roundtable consisted of scholars from both caucuses speaking about the field's poems, plays, both as closet dramas and in performance, and legacy. Michael Field, for those unfamiliar with the name, was the pen name of Catherine Bradley and her niece Edith Cooper. Together, they wrote numerous, though unperformed, verse dramas, but they're primarily known and studied for their poetry, their collaborative journal, published as Works and Days, and their association with the aesthetic circles in London during the fin de siècle. A Question of Memory had its only performance in the Field's collective lifetime at London's Opera Comique, where it received 2 subscription matinees in the fall of 1893. It was produced under the auspices of the Independent Theatre Society, a non-commercial company run by J.T. Grein along the lines of André Antoine's Théâtre Libre in Paris or Berlin's De Freie Bühne. Performances were by subscription and could thus be classed as private, avoiding the necessity of receiving a license for the play in question. As such, experimental works, or works with questionable material or themes, could be performed without the risk of censorship. As an example, Ibsen's Ghosts, whose treatment of inherited venereal disease certainly would not have passed the censor, was Grein's first ITS production. Like our volunteer reading cast, the actors who worked with the ITS fit rehearsals and performance around their current contracted work. As such, these were often scratch performances with rudimentary sets and blocking. The focus was on the text and its messages and ideas. The Question of Memory is set in the midst of the 1848 Hungarian Revolution and is based, apparently, on a true story. It opens with Ferenc Renyi, a village school teacher, receiving the summons to round up his volunteer troops and join the larger army massed against Habsburg forces. Thekla, Ferencz's fiancée, is upset by the news, but her sister Elizabeth, Ferencz's sister Fina, and their mother are thrilled at the opportunity to see their country freed. Ferencz's friend Stanislaus confesses his love for Elizabeth, but she turns him down, preferring to stand as a sort of figurehead to all the soldiers of the village. In Act 2, Austrian soldiers arrive in the village and announce that Ferenc has been captured. They take Fina, the mother, and Thekla to see him, hoping that the sight of them will be torture enough to convince him to reveal the hiding place of the rest of his unit. The plan, of course, fails. In Act 3, Fina and her mother refuse to ask Ferenc to give up the information, and so are shot off stage. Thekla then pleads with her fiancé to save her by telling the Austrians what they want to know. By this point, the traumatized Ferenc has lost all memory of the location and so cannot tell them, and Thekla is also taken out and shot. Act 4 sees Ferenc having made his way back to the village, where Elizabeth slowly realizes what's happened. Stanislaus returns shortly after and reveals that he, not Ferenc, gave up the location because the Austrians had threatened Elizabeth. Stanislaus now asks her not to marry him, but to create with him a home for Ferenc, and this time she agrees. I came to the question of memory by way of Lily Hall Caine, who played Thekla in the 1893 ITS production. When the opportunity arose to direct the stage reading, I immediately embraced the possibilities of nepotism and cast myself in Hall Caine's role. In doing so, I chose to quite literally embody my research. My Thekla was Michael Field's written Thekla, filtered through an image of Hall Caine's Thekla, encountered through an archive of contemporary audience member reactions. But my Thekla was also the product of a 21st century feminist actor's perspective and the training, methods, and limitations that implies. My own character work for this role was based on extensive archival research into the 1893 production, and particularly into traces of Hall Caine's own performance. And it's that intersection, the intersection to Julie Bush-Bailey's formulation of historical actor's body recovered through archival research and modern actor's body, that I'd like to spend the rest of my time today reflecting on. In thinking back on the intersection while I considered this presentation, two major issues came first to mind, both stemming from the vast historical difference between Lily Hall Caine in 1893 and myself in 2019. The first, obviously, is performance style generally, and the second involves the vast changes in the world in the intervening century. Given my scholarly interest in 19th century actors' performance theory more broadly, and how women in particular narrativize and circulate that theory, I'd like to start with that consideration. As I mentioned a moment ago, I went into preparations with the intention of using my knowledge of Hall Caine's own performance as a basis for my choices in the role. I quickly ran into the problem, however, of archival scope. As Sharon Marcus has noted in her recent study of celebrity culture, quote, "Archives have one significant limitation. People start to collect materials about famous individuals only after they have become noteworthy enough to merit documentation," end quote. As such, especially considering a performer like Hall Caine, who certainly wasn't and isn't well known, there are necessarily gaps in any attempted archival research. As a scholar, of course, these gaps are endlessly frustrating. As a practitioner, however, they actually make my job a bit more straightforward. While I can incorporate what little information there is on Hall Caine's Thekla and the more detailed information on her performances more generally, this became otherwise a fairly straightforward piece of modern character work on a historical text, which I'll return to later when I come to address the question of the piece's Hungarian nationalism. What is known about her performance in this particular role comes from contemporary reviews of the piece as a whole. These reviewers, especially those particularly offended by the representation of strong women in the play, singled out her acting using words such as natural, charming, realistic, and clever. Other than these comments, reviewers tended to bypass the thematic element of Thekla's role in the piece. I would argue, however, that Thekla's particular relation to her country, her duty, and herself, in fact, aligns with the play's central considerations. And what we can glean of Hall Caine's performance through these archival snippets suggests that the actor made deliberate choices to emphasize the conventional femininity of her character, which in turn served the larger themes of heroism and nationalism in Field's play. The question of heroism is closely tied to the question of gender in the piece, which, as in many 19th century plays, as well as in the Field's oeuvre more generally, clearly forms an important central consideration. In Act 4, Elizabeth and Stanislas discuss the meaning of country, a debate the two read as gendered. Stanislas asks, "What is country to most men but the place where the women live whom they have known? It is not for grass and rocks and streams they would shed their blood, but to save homes and mothers and sisters and sweethearts." To which Elizabeth responds, "A woman's country is not only the men she has known, it is the past, it is inheritance. The fields her forefathers plowed, the language she speaks, the pressure of the whole future. It is all she hopes for and venerates." Here, men see their country as a domestic haven to be protected. Heroism thus hinges on the ability to provide this protection. Women, however, see their country both as an ideology and as a physical entity, the fields, but also the past and the whole future. Heroism for women, then, rests in preserving a sense of connectivity between inheritance and futurity, anchored in a particular geographic location. The two avoid the question of Ferencz's heroism under these divergent definitions, and the possibility that, in addressing his actions, they might be forced to define the man they both love as unheroic, perhaps even as a traitor. In addressing this silence, Jill Ennin reads Ferencz's temporary amnesia as a feminized hysteria, one which both saves him and allows him to perform a woman's version of patriotism or heroism. I would suggest that Thekla's hysteria, the development of which interacts in really intriguing ways with Ferencz's in the Act 3 dialogue, to which I'll return, works similarly. It is her hysteria which drives Ferencz to his own. We've just seen his staunch stoicism as he sends his mother and sister to their deaths. But in recalling Thekla's entreaties, he says, quote, "I would have saved her at the last. When she shrieked, I tried with all my might to remember where I had left them. I called her back, but God was merciful. He took away my memory in time," end quote. Her loss of control causes his own. Her outburst and passionate entreaty cement his silence. And here, there's an important distinction, I think. Ferencz's hysteria allows him to act in a heroic manner to save his comrades. Thekla's hysteria forces her into a kind of unintentional heroism. She never intended to give her life for her country, but ends up doing so precisely because her hysterical, though earnest entreaties drive Ferencz beyond the point of coherence. Many contemporary reviewers dismissed the possibility of Thekla's heroism altogether. Though she's most often dubbed the heroine of the piece, which, in thinking about heroism and gender, is a term that certainly deserves more consideration, the graphic, for instance, suggests that, quote, "Nothing heroic is there about her. She is simply a winsome and childish creature, full of the joy of life and terrified at the prospect of death," end quote. Some reviewers note, however, a separation between the character and the actor. Hall Caine played the role to accentuate a specific meaning of heroism. Hall Caine's Thekla, though not necessarily Michael Field's Thekla, embodies the feminine nationalism Elizabeth delineates. Her aim is to preserve her home, her idea of futurity, and the futurity, by implication, of her country. The play then centers on three remarkably strong women, Elizabeth, Fina, and Ferencz's mother, and a hysterical woman, Thekla, who sees her duty as protecting a conventionally imagined view of the future. On first glance, the two kinds of women are diametrically opposed. The heroines are stoic, self-sacrificing, literally in the case of Fina and her mother, and see themselves as soldiers protecting their country in much the same way as the fighting men do. Thekla, in contrast, aims to preserve the futurity of her own vision of the ideal life and dismisses all thoughts of heroism. I would suggest, however, that these two versions of heroic sacrifice are not as different as they may seem. Thekla is certainly presented as, to use Jill Ennin's brilliantly succinct term, a ninny, but in Hall Caine's treatment, she is a ninny formed out of very specific 19th century expectations of conventional femininity. In working Hall Caine's characterization into my own, I was faced with the necessity, as I imagined she was, of finding this heroism lurking beneath the hysteria. To grapple with the apparent disjunction, I turned back to the reviews, particularly to those which commented on Hall Caine rather than on Thekla. The reviewer in Theatre Journal recognized, quote, "the insistent gentle pathos and absolute truth of her acting," end quote, a pair of phrases that suggests Hall Caine's incorporation of the kind of emotional engagement with the part more often associated with the non-commercial stage than with mainstream acting at the time. Similarly, other reviewers note the, quote, intense emotional work, end quote, underlying her performance, comment on the, quote, effect, end quote, of her emotional presentation, and focus on the, quote, tact and feeling, end quote, of her treatment of the character. Obviously, such related words as realistic, unaffected, and natural, which a handful of reviewers also use, must be treated with caution. These judgments are, of course, historically contingent and could refer either to something akin to what we'd think of today as naturalistic acting, or to the kind of natural presentation of unfiltered emotion underlying the gestural language of melodrama, or to any number of stylistic associations in between. But this repeated focus by the viewers on the visible and effective emotional work of Hall Caine's performance suggests the register in which she performed was one closer to naturalism than melodrama. For example, her hysterics in Act 3, when she pleads with Ferenz to save her, could so easily veer into melodrama, which in 1893, even in an independent, non-commercial production, would have been a fully acceptable choice. But the reviews suggest that Hall Caine delivers such lines as, "Ferenz, you will tell them all directly. Ferenz, you will save me. Ferenz, you must tell them what they want to know." Delivered these lines with a focus on the character's very relatable rising panic, rather than on the melodramatic potential of the moment. As Hall Caine wrote to the Fields after the performance, quote, "Lumps somehow come into the throat when one talks of Thekla," end quote. Thekla's situation causes, even in the actor embodying her, an instinctive, effective, and significantly internalized response, rather than a melodramatic display of emotion. Instead, as our production emphasized through the inclusion of the stage directions here, read by a narrator, Ferenz's continued silences, which break up Thekla's lines, play to the melodrama of the scene in stark contrast to the naturally acted hysteria of Thekla, and recall, of course, Peter Brooks's emphasis on the necessity of a silent character to any melodrama. The piece as a whole, of course, is written in sympathy to the Hungarian revolutionaries. The heroism I spoke of a moment ago, in both its gendered forms, is a distinctly nationalist one, which, for a modern actor returning to a historical text, poses a different set of problems. The Fields, of course, write at the end of the 19th century with no foreknowledge of Hungary's 20th and 21st century history, and with little knowledge of Hungary as a country at all, judging by the note appended to the published text, in which the Fields note that they, quote, neglected to give to Rennie's associates proper names distinctly Hungarian, end quote. The nationalist heroism at the heart of the piece does adapt the usual support on the melodramatic stage for the plucky underdog. But the historical reality on which the Fields base this language underscores Hungary's current right-wing nationalist rhetoric. Most modern accounts of the 1848 revolution and the War of Independence which followed note the basis of a Hungarian sense of national identity and pride in the ideologies of these years. As such, the nationalism or heroism Elizabeth and Stanislaus support, the idea of Hungary that Fina, her mother, and Thekla die for, also underlies such modern issues as the treatment of Roma people as second-class citizens, for instance, not to mention Hungary's affiliation with Germany in World War II, and in particular, the current revising of the school curriculum to reflect these nationalist ideals. How then, in 2019, might one approach some of these nationalist sentiments with the knowledge of what they would, half a century or a century later, lead to? Given what I've just said about Thekla's specific form of heroism, which seems to revise the nationalist forms expressed by Elizabeth and Stanislaus, this historical awareness actually helped me come to terms with some of Thekla's more cringeworthy lines, those which contemporary critics would have seen as proof of her, quote, striking the only true womanly note in the play, end quote. To take just one example from Act 2, Elizabeth berates Thekla for her insistence that she will ask Ferenz to speak, to save himself, rather than the other soldiers from the village. She asks scathingly, "Have you never been thrilled when you've heard of heroes?" And Thekla replies, simply and sadly, "I have never wanted to be the wife of anyone remarkable." On its own, this exchange positions Thekla as the fully domesticated anti-revolutionary, and Elizabeth as the brave heroine, supportive of the soldiers and their aims. The addition of historical knowledge, however, aligns Elizabeth's question with the later dangers rising from this nationalist rhetoric. As such, Thekla's answer shifts from a stereotypical domesticated response to a refusal of the rhetoric. The line can be read with 21st century knowledge of where this nationalism would lead Hungary as a denial of the heroic to provide happiness. The remarkable, in Thekla's view here, is dangerous. And from a 21st century perspective, she's right. The thrill Elizabeth hears in talk of heroism and the heroism itself would be used over the next century to justify countless atrocities. So what does this all mean for a consideration of practice-based research for the theater historian? Conventionally, as Jackie Bratton and Julie Bush Bailey note, particularly in the 19th century theater, a role would be passed down from performer to performer through living memory, a sort of embodied inheritance, reliance on physical and temporal proximity, ensuring the continuity of voice, gesture, posture, business, and so forth. Technically speaking, I've inherited this role directly from Hall Caine. We're the only two actors in the performance history of the piece to have played Thekla. And that connection, that embodied inheritance, because of the temporal gap between the two performances, is what I'm having to discover through archival academic research. In turn, because of the gaps in the archive, as I've discovered, my modern training and historical knowledge became necessary to a detailed consideration of the character. As such, the combination of the two, scholarly research and practical exploration, became necessary to approach the character. As Diana Taylor has argued, there's a parallel embodied archive of repertoire which exists alongside the text-based archive and which needs to be given equal consideration. In basing my character work on a combination of archival work and modern performance practice, I have better access to Lily Hall Caine's Thekla, to the embodied archive, than I would have done through either of these methods alone. Performance by modern practitioners, then, can illuminate elements of historical pieces that more conventional scholarly approaches would have difficulty accessing.